Hey YouTube, just a video here about how to hang oak fire doors. The interesting thing about fire doors is just how heavy they are. They're still laminate oak with a few bits of solid oak on the outsides, but they weigh 50 kilograms, so that takes you as quite a surprise. But nonetheless, it's still not too bad hanging these. Really, the first thing to consider once you've decided on your style is to order the right size door. Now, I'm not going to go through the measurements here because you get varied measurements for oak doors, but ultimately you need to select the one that's the closest fit to your door frame. Door frames and doors are fairly standard sizes, so they should fit. Don't worry if it's a few mil out here and there, or it's an old door. You can trim doors down, albeit different amounts of trimming for different doors and for different purposes. The general rule of thumb I go by, and I think this works for fire doors as well, is you can shave 6mm from the top and the bottom and 6mm from the sides. That's 12mm in total. But this does vary, and the stipulation about what you can shave is a bit more stringent with fire doors. So just look at the regulation for your door. Generally speaking, it may be less than 12mm, maybe 10mm, and that might only be from the bottom of a door of a fire door, not from both. But it's different for different fire doors and for different purposes, and if you're going to put extra materials around the door to give it that fire protection, so bear that in mind. Now you do have to maintain a gap of around 1 or 2mm all the way around the door where the frame is. Ideally you want this as tight as possible to maintain a tight seal. I believe the maximum you can take off a fire door is between 8 and 10mm at the bottom. The reason I chose fire doors, obviously there's that added extra safety, but I feel that they look and they feel a lot heavier and feel like they're made of higher quality, especially when you tap them and you knock on them. So I'll always go for fire doors in future. You just get a really light feeling with non-fire doors, which I don't like. Now once you've offered up your door to your door frame, you'll be aware of how much material you need to take off. Generally speaking, I think the best ways to remove material is if with a planer, electric or handheld, or a plunge saw. If you're lucky and it's very close fit, you probably can sand it. With the plane sander, now this does work quite well. It's a very powerful tool and you can take off degrees of about 1/2 mil. Personally, I don't like it because I find that when you come off the door, you can cause some damage or unevenness, and when you go back over the door on the side to straighten it out, you take off more material and it ends up being a bit of a fuss. I think with a bit of practice you could probably get the hang of it, but I just prefer a plunge saw, a lot more accurate. You literally take off the exact material that you wish, nothing more, nothing less. So it's the tool that I tend to use for this. Now don't try and get it right first time. It's not uncommon to have to make 2 or 3 cuts. Best that you make 2 or 3 cuts than when one large cut and overcut, of which there's no coming back from. So I tend to take off just slightly under what I think I need to take off, remeasure, and then take off another bit of material so it fits perfectly. When you're getting near the perfect measurement, I tend to use some sort of scribe. This is a great little tool from Trend here, which you can follow the size of the frame and get an exact measurement for your door. One thing to note here is that never take off material from the frame, always the door, because your eye is immediately drawn to the frame. So always remove material from the door, not the frame. Now as you can see on these images here, I tape the side of my doors to limit breakout. It's not really the end of the world because any kind of breakout you can sand back down. It's just something I like to do. And I always like this plunge saw because you can't really go wrong. It takes a bit of time to set up, but you get the perfect cut and can shave off any degree of wood you wish. And you can also retain the wood for future repairs that I'll talk about at the end of this video. Now once you're happy with your door dimensions and your frame dimensions, it's time to start thinking about hinges. I use this good little jig here that holds the door in place whilst I mark up and do all my work really. Hinges are an interesting one. So a fire door, you're going to need 3 hinges. When you go into most offices, you tend to see 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. Now when you read up, it tends to be, people state this is the stronger way of having the 3 hinges. Most of the weight is felt at the top of the door. A lot of in-depth reading shows actually there's not much in it. There's hardly anything to justify having 2 at the top, so it's more about aesthetics. So I prefer to have 3 evenly spaced hinges. As you can see here on this video, they look evenly spaced, but they're actually not. So at the top here, the top of the top hinge is actually 6 inches down from the top. So measure 6 inches from the top of the hinge, and that's where you place your first hinge. At the bottom of the bottom hinge is actually 9 inches up from the bottom. Now the reason you do this is purely through aesthetics. When you look at a door, you are around 5'5" to 6 foot high, so you don't get an even look at the door. When the hinges are spaced evenly, 6 and 6, it looks a bit odd. So 9 and 6 visually is the most attractive, and then the centre hinge is in the centre of those two. I've tried it both ways, and it really does make a difference having the 9 and the 6 opposed to the 6 and the 6. Once you're happy with where your hinges are going to go, there are a range of techniques again of how you relieve the material. Most common will be hand chisels. You can use routers, or I've got a specific jig here which I bought and quite like. It's a self-centering jig, but you can set up so that it cuts off to the side to do hinges as well. The reason I like routers or jigs is that you remove the exact material that you need, and there's no trying to build the space back up with paper if you dig down too deep. It's not too bad with oak. Oak you can get a fairly flat finish, but with softer wood it's very hard to get that same perfect finish. Now before you start relieving the material, you have to mark up where your hinges want to go. I literally just place the hinges as stated before, 6 and 9, and mark round with a pencil. You can use a Stanley knife to mark that line. I don't really feel the need because I finish off my hinges with the chisel, but you can use a Stanley blade, which means you won't go beyond that point. Now the reason I've got this photo of this finished hinge here is that it shows you that the two plates of the hinge are actually not the same. As you can see here, part of this hinge plate is cut out. Now that is always the plate that goes on the door side. I'll put a little arrow there where you can see where it's cut out. Mark around the hinge with this correct plate in place. When everything is marked, it's time to relieve the material. This jig bolts onto the side of the door and uses cutters of different sizes. You can move the cutter over to the right, so the cutter will remove the material off the side of the door. These are great. As you can see, there's a depth stop there, so you don't go too deep. Each time I do a new cut, I'll reset that depth stop, because I find if you don't, it can tend to move a little bit, and it's quite an easy setup, as you can just see in these images. And you can cut things ranging from small as a hinge to a lock. As you can see there, the cutter, it cuts right off the side of the wood, and I always leave a couple of mil to finish off by chisel, because I just think it's a bit more accurate, and I can be certain that I get the exact finish I want and as tight as I want. I have tried getting the same result with hand chisels. With oak you can get close to it, but you're never going to get this same perfect finish. And I like, even though you can't see it, I like to have that exact finish and the exact relief material all the way around as best as you can. But as you can see, I won't rely on the tool all the way. I'll use the hinge to mark the outside of the hinge, and then finish off with a chisel. The material falls away quite quickly when you use the flat surface as a guide. So now it's time to put the screws in. I have this nice little set of hinge drill bits. What they do is they self-center on the hinge and put a little drill mark onto the door, which you then screw with a screw bit. This prevents the screw from going into the hinge off center. There's quite a lot of force that goes through these screws, so if you don't get them exactly center, they can pull the hinge to the left and the right. So you've done all that work to get a nice fitting hinge, and then the screw pulls it away. So it only takes 2 seconds to set up, and you always get a perfectly centered screw. I'll then go on to use a small drill bit just to relieve a bit more material. Obviously the oak is very dense, and I don't want to put too much force through those screws, because you just ruin the heads, and this ruins the aesthetic look of the hinge. Now this jig comes with a range of different cutters for different purposes. I tend to use the larger ones for the hinges, because you can move them off center, but for locks you can get ones that are specifically made to be the exact size of the lock. Go slowly. I tend to cut with quite fast revolutions, taking out a small amount of material at a time. Just be careful that to really lock that jig in place so you don't get cut over your lines. So once your hinges are in place, next it's time to consider the lock. You can use this jig, self-centering jig, for the same purpose, and set the depth stop as you require. Now I tend to relieve the amount of material that needs to be removed the least first, so that'll be the faceplate first, and then move on to the lock, just the way I like to do it. Make sure you measure twice and cut once, and again I cut within the pencil lines and finish off with a hinge. As you can see here, it creates a nice neat relief for the faceplate to go in. Then you can use a small bit that's equal to the size of your lock and penetrate the door. If you don't go all the way in as far as you can use a drill or a spade bit to finish off. And this tends to be quite a lengthy process of cutting, remeasuring, placing the lock in, as you can see here. Once your lock is in place, it's time to cut the shaft of the handle. Obviously remove the lock and measure the exact space where the shaft should go through, and use a spade bit to penetrate through to the door. I cut from both sides of the door to limit any breakout and damage to the door, so I'll drill halfway and then halfway in again. So it's very, very key that your measurements are perfect. Use a spade bit, which causes the shaft to have a little bit of space around it. If it's too tight, then you'll have a tight fitting door and you won't get that spring, that's that nice feeling in your hand. The shaft simply slots through the door and the lock, and the door handles are placed on it and held in place with a grub screw. You do need to use your provided flathead screws to screw the door handle to the door, because over time the grub screw just isn't enough to hold it in place. And with these door handles, they were quite fiddly because I couldn't get a screwdriver, so I bought this special little tool here that holds a flathead screwdriver. I was able to turn them. Now before you do this, because the oak is such dense wood, you have to pre-drill these holes. So I suggest you practice on a piece of wood so that you get the right drill bit and you put the screw in, which causes enough force to be able to hold the lock in place, but not so you have to put so much force through the screws. The reason for this is that these are aesthetic screws, flatheads, and they're chromed, so you can't put much force turning them and you can easily damage them, so you don't want to be able to put too much force. So pre-drill the holes and use a tool just to turn the screws. To protect the screws further, I tend to put a bit of blue tape on it, as you can see here, just to protect the screw should there be any slippage. One thing to be careful here is how long are your screws and how thick is your door. With my door handles here, the two screws would have met in the middle should they have been placed in the same location. So I've reversed the faceplate of the handle, so you get the centre at the top of one side and the centre at the bottom on the other side, so the two screws didn't match. So when you're fitting doors, you really have to think about everything before you make that cut or make that screw, because as soon as you do, there's no coming back. So just plan everything. Now that your door is complete, it's time to offer up your door to your frame. There's a great little tool here that goes underneath the door and you pump it up. It lifts it so you can get an accurate measurement of your hinges on your door frame. Once your hinges are marked up with a pencil, you can relieve them with a chisel. My jig doesn't fit my door frames. You can get jigs that work with routers, but my jig won't fit, so I had to relieve them with this chisel. Now there is a technique with chisels for relieving a small amount of wood at a time, but I wasn't happy at all with these. It's very old, cheap, soft pine in this house, and no matter what I did, how much time I spent, it always seemed to crumble. In future, I think I will use this jig just here and use a router trying to get the same effect as I did on the door, but I'll save that for a future video. But as you can see, the wood seemed to crumble. It wouldn't relieve evenly, so I had to use these bits of card to bolster the hinge out, which is not a big deal if you don't see it, but it's not very pretty, so wasn't very happy with that. It just seemed that no matter how hard I tried, how much time I took, what technique I used, the wood just seemed to crumble. It didn't relieve in an even fashion, so that might just be the age of the wood, 1930s building. Now once you've relieved all the material, you can use that same tool to lift the door and screw in your hinges. You've got a bit more freedom here because all for my doors they were painted doors. If you do make a mistake, then you can just fill this in. It's a little bit harder to come back from oak, but there shouldn't really be much mistakes if you follow the process as per the doors. As you can see here, there's a range of different tools. You can use a reverse clamp to lift the door, but I'm much more of a fan of these bags. They're so simple and you can get them into tiny little areas to lift the doors, and they lift upwards of 100 kilograms very precisely, so I was very happy with that, and we're using them in future. Now what you might find is that when you put the door back on its hinges and close the door, although it was a perfect fit before, the hinges have pushed it out a little bit even though they're recessed in. So what I prefer to do is, whilst the door is in place, just work out where the high spots are and sand them down. This can take quite a while. One of these doors took me an hour, but what I don't want to do is take the door off and relieve too much material, or relieve the material evenly and have an uneven space. I prefer to get that space, that 1 or 2 mil gap, even all the way around, and use some sandpaper. And like I said, you never sand the frame, always the door. Next is the strike plate. The way to find the correct position for this is close the door on the door frame and get the rough position where the strike plate is. The next issue is how far into the door frame do you place the strike plate. So if you place the strike plate on the door lock, you'll see the centre of the door lock on the door is the centre of the strike plate. So by closing the door, you can find the centre line on the door frame. As you see there with that arrow, the centre of that lock is the centre of the strike plate. So you can get an accurate measurement of where the strike plate should go. It's actually more complicated than you first think, because you want the strike plate to be positioned where the door will close and be flush with the door frame. If your strike plate is positioned properly, all you have to do is close the door and place the door stops, starting with the edge of the hinges and work your way around your door to get a nice tight fix. And once you've done that, your door is complete and ready for a wax polish. Decided to go for this clear coat because the look of these doors was so good. I wanted to maintain the grain and the colour. It darkens it slightly, but it still maintains the original effect of the door, and you'd supply it with a rag and it creates no marks or brush marks or patches at all. And I was very happy with the look, and I think I'll be using this for all doors in future. Now, I did want to talk about mistakes. I did make a few mistakes on these doors, and this first image here is when on my very first door I placed the hinge too low. So rather than just leave it where it was, when I took a section of another door off the bottom to give that clearance, I actually laminated that to the side of the door, so it's probably about 2mm, and sanded it down. What you have to remember that these doors are laminate doors anyway. Although they're fire doors, they are laminate doors. So you're not doing anything to the door that's not been done already. And if you spend quite a bit of time, you can actually make it so it's unnoticeable. If you make a PVA and sawdust paste to fill in any gaps, then you can barely notice any corrections you make. The second correction I want to talk about was when I first inspected this door, I found a little chip in it. I decided to rectify it rather than send it back. So in the same principle as before, I laminated a piece of wood and sanded it down. And when I was trying to find this photo for this video, it took me about 2 minutes to find it, because you literally can't see it at all, especially after you stain it. So these little marks, dents and scratches, even if you make them yourself, they are recoverable, and it won't stop your project moving forward and looking great. The last mistake was quite a big one. When I was taking some material off the bottom of the door, I cut too deeply, and you can see in this image here, I've cut down to the internal aspect of the door, and it shows you the different thicknesses of the different laminate. It's not really the end of the world, because it would be the top or the bottom of the door, but I did want to resolve it, so I took that into account when removing the top part of the door, and I had a previous section from a door that I'd removed and actually laminated that to the top of the door. Now, you leave it for a day and it does look a bit rough, as you can see here, but this is a good example of how you can rectify these doors. When I gave it a sand and used a bit of paste with the sawdust, you could barely notice any difference. As you can see here, it looks like it's constructed out of the factory, and you can barely see that anything's happened at all. So I was very happy with that result, from what I first thought was a mistake that I couldn't recover from. So any mistake to a certain degree is recoverable. These doors are all wood glue laminate anyway, so there's nothing you can't overcome. So that's it really. So I'm going to do one other video in the future. These are photos from a previous job, but I'd like to do a video and have included how to use a router with my router jig. So I'll be doing that shortly. And thank you for watching.